Episode 1. Patrick is coming in the morning. You should know before anything else that I am not doing this because I am afraid of dying. I want to be honest about that, at least at the start, while honesty still feels like a choice rather than a symptom. A lot of people arrive at the edge of their lives and suddenly find religion, or find confession, or find the telephone number of someone they wronged in 1987 and decide that a single phone call in the final weeks will balance the ledger. I have watched 2 people die in this ward in the 3 weeks I have been here. The man 2 rooms down whose family came and came and came and then stopped coming, and then he was gone on a Tuesday with no particular ceremony, and what I noticed was that in the last days both of them were trying to account for themselves. Both of them needed someone to tell them that the math worked out, that the good outweighed the bad by enough of a margin that the crossing over had a kind of clearance to it, a permission. I don't need that, or if I do, I've decided not to need it, which is close enough. What I need is something different and harder to name. I need to say this out loud to something outside my own skull, because I have been saying it inside my skull for 22 years, and the interior of a human skull is not a neutral space. Things said only to yourself grow architecture over time. They put up walls. They find the grammar that exonerates you, and then they use that grammar exclusively until you can no longer find the original sentence, the sentence without the architecture, the sentence that says only what happened. I need to find that sentence again before morning, because Patrick is coming in the morning. He called last night, which is to say 2 nights ago now. It is past 3 o'clock, and the ward has gone to that particular quality of quiet that only exists after midnight in hospitals. The quiet that is not peaceful but simply depleted, all the daytime energy drained away, and what remains is the sound of machines doing the work that bodies can no longer do entirely on their own. Patrick called, and his voice had that quality it gets when he is being careful with me, measured, like a man carrying a full glass across a room. He said he would be there by 10, that he'd taken the bus because his car was still in the shop. The shop, meaning the driveway of a man named Gordon Fells, who has been promising to look at it since October and has not, and that he'd bring the good coffee from the place on Ambrose Street if I was still able to drink coffee. I told him I was still able to drink coffee. That was generous of me. The truth is that coffee now tastes like something approximating coffee the way a photograph of a fire approximates warmth. My body has been engaged for several months in the project of shutting down the non-essential systems, and taste, somewhere along the way, was deemed non-essential. But I said yes to the coffee because I wanted Patrick to have something to carry when he walked through the door, something to hold. Patrick has always done better with something to hold. He is 51 minutes younger than me. I have never once let him forget that, and he has never once pretended to care, and that dynamic, my insistence and his indifference, is probably the most accurate summary of our relationship I can give you in a single sentence. I have a daughter. Her name is Mara, and she is 19, and she is at university in Edinburgh, which is where I wanted her to be. And she calls on Wednesdays and sometimes Sundays, and the calls have been getting longer as I have been getting shorter. She knows I'm dying. She does not know what I am about to tell you. She may never know what I am about to tell you, because what I decide to do with what I tell you, whether I then tell Patrick in the morning, whether I hand him this thing I have been carrying in the place where his name lives inside me, I haven't decided yet. I am going to tell you everything first, and then I will decide. My name is James Calloway. I am 46 years old. I have liver failure, which is not alcoholic in origin, despite what the residents assumed. When they first saw my chart, I watched one of them recalibrate when she reviewed the labs and couldn't find the evidence she expected. I have primary sclerosing cholangitis, which is an autoimmune condition and has nothing to do with drinking, and which I have had, without knowing, for perhaps 15 years, the disease advancing so slowly and so quietly that by the time it announced itself, I was already past the point where a transplant was a realistic conversation. There is a specific cruelty in that particular timeline that I have spent some months sitting with. The body that has been slowly killing me is the body that has been perfectly sober for reasons entirely unrelated to guilt. I want you to know that. I want you to know it now, at the beginning, before I tell you about the night of October 14th, 2002. So that when I tell you about that night, you cannot dismiss what I did as the behavior of an alcoholic, as a disease, as something that was not entirely mine. What I did that night, I did as a sober man who happened on that one night not to be sober. I want to be precise about everything. I think precision is the last dignity available to me. His name was Owen Marsh. He was 23 years old. He was cycling home from a late shift at a restaurant called Hadley's, which no longer exists. The building converted into flats sometime in the early 2010s. He was wearing a reflective vest, I want to tell you that. Because it matters, and because the official account never emphasized it enough, and because for 22 years I have been in possession of the knowledge that Owen Marsh was wearing a reflective vest on the night he died and was doing nothing wrong and was not difficult to see, and what happened to him was not an accident in any honest use of that word. He died because I made a choice. And then I made another one. And my brother Patrick has been living inside the consequences of the second choice for 22 years, in the way that a man lives inside a house he didn't build and can't sell and can't fully explain to the people who ask how he came to be there. Let me start earlier. Let me start where it actually starts, which is not on a road in October but in a hospital in January, 31 years before that, in the particular and unasked for intimacy of being born 2 minutes apart from another person and spending the next several decades trying to establish the meaningful difference between you. Let me tell you about Patrick first, because he deserves that. He deserves to be the first thing you understand. Episode 2. What twins know. There is a thing that happens when you grow up as a twin that I have never been able to explain adequately to people who are not twins, and I have tried in conversation, in the architecture of relationships, in the way I have spent my professional life, designing spaces where two people can occupy the same room without erasing each other, which is perhaps not a coincidence. The thing is this: you come into consciousness already knowing that your identity is a negotiation. Most people spend their early years assembling a self from the raw material of the world: parents, siblings, school, language, the particular slope of the light in the room where they first understood that they were a separate thing from everything else. They build a self, and it feels, if they are lucky, like something original, something theirs. Even the children who grow up with older brothers and sisters, even they have a period where the self is being made in a space that belongs exclusively to them. Patrick and I did not have that. We came into the world already a set. My mother used to tell the story. She told it at Christmas. She told it when Patrick and I fought. She told it when we were too old for her to tell it, and told it anyway, of watching the doctor hold me up in the delivery room and how I turned my head immediately in the direction of Patrick, who was still unborn. She said the doctor laughed and said, "He's already looking for his brother." She told that story with a love in it that I understood even as a child was not entirely about me. It was about the image, the idea of us, the twins who arrived already oriented toward each other. I don't know if it's true. Memory is a storyteller, not a court reporter, and my mother had a novelist's instinct for the image that carried the most weight. But I have never been able to not believe it, which is perhaps the same thing as it being true. We grew up in Burnley, in Lancashire, in a terraced house on Arkwright Street that smelled permanently of the particular combination of cigarettes and cooking fat, and something I can only describe as old wool, the smell of a house that has been occupied continuously by people who worked with their bodies and came home tired. My father worked at the mill until the mill closed, and then he worked at a distribution warehouse until his back gave out, and then he worked at a newsagent's until his back stopped being the main problem. My mother worked at a doctor's surgery as a receptionist for 23 years, not because she loved it, but because it was regular, and because the hours meant She was home when we got out of school, and she had decided, with the quiet ferocity of her particular generation of women, that she was going to be home when we got out of school. They were not unkind people. I want to say that clearly because it matters, because the story I am about to tell you does not have its origins in a damaged childhood, and I am tired of the cultural habit of tracing every adult failure back to some wound in the formation. My parents were limited people in the way that most people are limited by circumstance, by education, by the inherited emotional vocabulary of their own parents, which was sparse and practical, and not much given to the examination of interior states. They loved us. They expressed that love primarily through presence and provision, and a kind of watchful, slightly anxious attention that was its own form of tenderness, even when it didn't feel like tenderness. What they couldn't give us, what nobody gave us, was a way of being separate from each other that felt like a natural thing. Because we looked alike, people treated us as interchangeable in ways they would never have intended to be cruel. Teachers called one of us by the other's name and corrected themselves and moved on, as if the error were minor, as if names were merely labels that could be swapped without consequence. Friends of the family would squint at us in the way people squint at a word they're not certain how to pronounce, and then guess and get it wrong more often than the laws of probability could fully account for. We were, to the outside world, the Calloway twins, which was a category, not two people. The consequence of this, and I am telling you this not as an excuse but as a context, because context is not exculpation, and I am done confusing the two. The consequence was that Patrick and I developed an almost pathological sensitivity to each other's distinctness. We became, in private, fiercely insistent on being different, not in the performative way of twins who dress oppositely or choose opposite sports to mark the distinction. Deeper than that, we became attuned to any quality the other possessed that could not be attributed to shared genetics. Patrick was better at drawing. I was faster at mathematics. Patrick trusted people readily and was often wrong too. I was slow to trust and often wrong to be. Patrick had a quality I can only call openness, a kind of permeability to other people's emotional states that I have spent my adult life recognizing as a form of extraordinary intelligence, even though I spent our childhood dismissing it as softness. He cried more easily than I did. I know how that sounds now. From this distance, from this room, like I'm describing a deficit he had and a strength I had. At the time, I did experience it that way. I was 18, 20, 22, and Patrick would cry at films, at news stories, at the particular expression on our mother's face when she was trying not to show that something hurt, and I would feel a complicated mixture of recognition, because the feeling was in me too. I felt it. The same stimulus landed the same way. And contempt, not contempt for Patrick, contempt for the crying, the visibility of it, the way it gave the feeling to the room. I learned very young to keep my feelings in the room of my face, behind the face. Patrick never learned that. He felt no need to learn it. He was, I think, a more fully realized human being than I was in those years, which is why it was so easy to dismiss him. There is a pattern in that, isn't there? The qualities we most need to diminish in someone else are frequently the ones that illuminate our own deficits. I understood that by 35. I wish I had understood it by 24. We were both at college in Manchester by that point, different courses, different digs, but close enough that we met most Sundays for lunch at a pub called the Goshawk that has since been turned into a chain restaurant. We were not close in the way our parents idealized they pictured us, I think, as inseparable as the unit they'd created. And the reality was, two young men who were genuinely fond of each other, but also quietly engaged in the permanent, low-level project of establishing that they were not each other. We talked about our lives with a selective honesty. We talked about our ambitions with more candor than we talked about our fears. We talked about women in the way young men talk about women when they are trying to seem more experienced than they are, and are talking to someone who knows them well enough to read the performance, which meant the performance was always slightly exhausting and also not entirely without affection. Patrick was studying illustration and graphic design. He was good genuinely, specifically good in a way that had nothing to do with his being my brother. I say that because it matters. He had a hand that understood the relationship between what the eye perceived and what the line could do, and he had something rarer, an instinct for what to leave out. His drawings had a quality of restraint that surprised people who knew him, because Patrick in person was warm and available and gave you the impression of someone who held nothing back. His art held everything back. I have thought about that contradiction many times in the years since. I think the drawings were where he kept what he couldn't show in his face. I was studying architecture. It suited something in my temperament that I recognized even then, the insistence on precision, on function, on the designed resolution of the problem of two people in the same space. I liked the idea of building things that would outlast me. I liked the idea of my name on a blueprint. I was, in the particular way of young men who have been told they are intelligent and have had no serious reason yet to doubt it, somewhat in love with my own future. That was who we were on October 14th, 2002. I was 24 years old and very certain of who I was going to be. I want to pause here for a moment and tell you about Glennis. Not because she is the reason I need you to understand that, but because she is part of the context, and because she has been so carefully excised from the official story of that night that putting her back is one of the obligations I have been carrying. Her name was Glennis Parr. She was 26, a postgraduate student in English literature, and she was Patrick's girlfriend, had been for 8 months. They had met at a party neither of them had particularly wanted to attend, and the relationship had that specific quality of relationships that begin in mild reluctance. It was affectionate and unhurried and undriven by the anxious energy of two people trying to make something happen. They were simply good together in the way that certain people are simply good together, in the way that requires no maintenance beyond showing up. And I had watched this with the particular feeling of a man who has never had a relationship with that quality and isn't entirely sure whether he resents its existence or simply finds it alien. I liked Glennis. I want to say that directly. She was sharp and funny, and she had a habit of quoting things accurately and at length that might have been irritating in someone less willing to be self-deprecating about it. She asked good questions and meant them. She called me James when Patrick wasn't in the room, and Jim when he was, which I found interesting and never asked about. She had been with Patrick for 8 months when the night of October 14th happened. She stayed with him through the investigation, through the charges, through the sentencing. She stopped coming to the prison after 18 months. I have not spoken to her since. Pause note, a silence here. Not long. The length of a breath, held and released. Patrick never blamed her for that. He told me so, explicitly, more than once, and with a conviction I am no longer certain how to read. He said she had her own life to build. He said you can't ask a person to wait for something that has no certain end. He said he understood, which Patrick always says. Patrick always understands. It is possibly his defining quality, and also possibly the one that has cost him most. And I sat with those conversations, in the full knowledge that if I had not done what I did on that road and in that interview room, Glennis Parr would still have been in his life, would perhaps still be now, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the evening. Let me take you back to October, to the cold and the dark and the particular state of mind I was in when I got into Patrick's car. Episode 3. His jacket on my shoulders. You need to understand the ordinariness of the beginning of that night. This is not a story that begins with foreboding, with some presentiment of catastrophe that I ignored. There was no warning. There was no moment where I looked at what I was about to do and felt the weight of it before it happened. The night of October 14th, 2002 began in the most routine possible way. A group of people who knew each other well enough, a house party in a flat in Levenshulme, the kind of party that exists primarily as an excuse for the first drink, after which the party itself becomes irrelevant. I was there without a particular reason to be there. A friend of a friend, A birthday I barely remembered accepting the invitation to, the specific social calculus of a 24-year-old trying to fill a Friday evening. I had been in the architecture studio until 6, working on a project, and I was tired in the pleasant way of sustained, productive work. The kind of tired where the body has been used and is satisfied by it, and the mind is still moving, but moving at a lower gear. I showered, I changed, I walked to Patrick's flat, which was 8 minutes from mine, to borrow his car. He lent it without a second thought. That is important. He didn't hesitate, didn't add conditions, just took the keys from the hook beside his door and put them in my hand. He was staying in that night. He and Glennis were watching something. They had that sealed, domestic quality of a couple who have recently discovered that staying in together is its own form of pleasure. And Patrick was in the kitchen making tea when I arrived, and he called through that the keys were on the hook and to check the oil light because he'd been meaning to sort it and hadn't. I took his jacket too. My coat was at the studio, left behind in the end-of-day rush, and it was October cold, the particular October cold of Manchester, which is not the dramatic cold of December, but something more insidious, a damp, pervasive chill that finds the gaps in your clothing. And Patrick's jacket was on the hook beside the keys, and it fit me well enough because we are the same height, the same shoulder width, the same everything that can be measured externally, which is the source of all the confusion and all the weight of everything that followed. I put on his jacket, I took his keys. He called goodbye from the kitchen, and I called goodbye from the door. Glennis said to have a good time. I had a good time. I had, by my own reckoning at the time, about 4 drinks over 3 hours, perhaps 5. Not 8, not 10. I was not spectacularly, demonstrably drunk in the way that allows the story to accommodate the word accident. I was impaired. I was, specifically, sufficiently impaired that my perception of my own impairment was itself impaired, which is the specific treachery of alcohol at the threshold where most people feel competent and are not. I felt fine. I felt, if anything, slightly elevated, pleasantly warmed, slightly confident, the slight numbing of social anxiety that functions as one of alcohol's most effective lies. I drove home at 11:30. I took the route down Stockport Road because there was roadwork on the main cut-through I usually used, and I'd come that way, and I knew it added 5 minutes but not more. It was a clear night, dry. The streetlights were working. There was traffic, not heavy, occasional, the specific rhythm of a weeknight in a residential district after 11, the pubs emptying, people finding their way home. I want to tell you about the moment before it happened, in the only honest way I know how to tell it, which is to say, there was no dramatic moment before. There was road. There was the familiar weight of the wheel. There was the radio at low volume and the amber repetition of the streetlights passing. There was the complete and self-deceived certainty of a man who believes he is fine. And then Owen Marsh was in the road. He came from the left side, from the darkness between 2 streetlights, not running, cycling, and there was the flash of the reflective vest, the registered yellow-white of it in my headlights. And I processed it wrong. I processed it 1 fraction of a second too slowly, or the distance between processing and acting was 1 fraction of a second too long, or both, and I braked, but I braked after the contact, not before. The sound was not what you would expect. That is one of the things that lives most persistently in my body when I do not control the memory, the sound. Not a dramatic collision, not the sound of destruction. Something briefer and more mechanical than that. And then the particular sound of a bicycle in the road, the spinning wheel, the metal on the tarmac. I stopped the car. I want you to hear that. I stopped the car. I sat for what I now calculate was between 30 and 45 seconds, though in the memory it is both instantaneous and eternal, because time in those moments loses the agreement it normally maintains with the clock. And in those 30 to 45 seconds, I did not get out of the car. I looked in the rear-view mirror. I could see the bicycle in the road and the shape beside it. The shape was still. Not still in the way of someone dazed and trying to gather themselves. Still in the way that communicates to some portion of the human nervous system that operates below language, That stillness is no longer a temporary state. I knew. I am going to say that plainly because it is true, and because the version of events in which I did not fully know, in which I told myself he was fine, in which I rationalized the driving away as a decision made in incomplete information, that version is a lie I have been maintaining for a long time, and I am not willing to maintain it anymore. I knew. Not with the certainty of a doctor or an investigator, not with the evidence of a pulse taken and not found, but with the certainty that the body communicates to itself when language is too slow and too cowardly to carry the knowledge. I drove away. I drove the remaining 12 minutes home with the specific, focused concentration of a man who has decided, not consciously in the way that decisions announce themselves, but in the way that the most consequential decisions are actually made in the dark, below the level of deliberation, by the part of the self that acts before the self has agreed to act. I parked the car. I went inside. I sat on the edge of my bed in Patrick's jacket. The jacket was the thing I remember most clearly, the smell of it, which was Patrick's smell, the specific combination of the soap he used and something that was simply him, the particular biological signature that is always slightly different, even when every genetic component is shared. I sat in his jacket, and I did not call anyone, and I did not go back out, and I did not do anything except sit and let the knowledge of what I had done accumulate in me the way water accumulates in a room with no drain. I found out 2 days later that Owen Marsh had died. I found out from the Manchester Evening News, the paper my mother sent me every week, still physical, still folded and posted in an envelope with a small handwritten note she included, until the week she died, and his name was, on page 7, a short piece, 23 years old, restaurant worker, cycling home, hit and run. A photograph of him that someone had given to the paper, taken at what looked like a birthday or Christmas. He was mid-laugh, the caught, candid kind that makes someone look most like themselves. I read the piece 3 times. I put the paper in the bin. I did not call the police. And now, I need to tell you what happened when the police came to me. Episode 4, the 30 seconds. They came on the 3rd day, which would have been a Monday. It was a detective constable and a uniformed officer. I have the detail of their ranks because I have thought about that morning so many times that even the peripheral details have been worn into deep grooves, but I have no memory of their names. One of them was a woman, DC something, late 30s, with a quality of measured quietness that I initially took for tiredness and later understood was the professional stillness of someone who watches reactions for a living. The other was younger, the uniformed officer, and he was the one who spoke first. They came to Patrick's flat first. I need you to understand, this is where the geography of the thing becomes the thing. They came to Patrick's flat first because the car was registered to Patrick. Patrick's name, Patrick's address. I was on Patrick's insurance as a named driver. Our father had insisted on this. An old habit of carefulness. He'd put us both on each other's insurance since we were 17, and we'd simply never removed it. But the car was Patrick's. The plates led to Patrick. Patrick called me that morning before they arrived at his flat. He called me confused. I could hear it in his voice. The specific confusion of someone who is being asked to account for something they don't yet understand they need to account for. He said the police were there. He said they'd asked him about Friday night. He said he'd told them he was home. He said they'd shown him something, photographs, he thought, some kind of evidence, and asked if he'd lent the car to anyone, and he'd said yes. He'd said, I'd had the car. I said, okay. I said, I'll come over. And then I sat on the edge of my bed, for I have measured this many times in the years since, with the specific compulsive measurement of someone who needs to know the exact dimensions of the thing they did for what I believe was between 30 and 40 seconds. In those 30 to 40 seconds, 2 things were true simultaneously. The first truth was that I needed to go to Patrick's flat and tell the detective constable what I had told no one yet, that I had been the driver, that I had been in the car, that I had been wearing Patrick's jacket and driving Patrick's car, and that what happened on Stockport Road on the night of October 14th had happened to me, not to Patrick, and that Patrick had been home all night making tea and watching television with Glenys Parr, and had as much to do with Owen Marsh's death as anyone else in Manchester who had been safely inside their own house that evening. The second truth was that if I said this, my life as I understood it to be ending and being rebuilt in its own ruins. I want to be careful here. I want to be more careful here than I have been in 22 years of private repetition of this moment, because the version of this that I have most often told myself is the version in which I was overwhelmed, in which I froze, in which the decision was made by my nervous system before my better self had the chance to intervene. And there is some truth in that version. There is always some truth in the self-exculpating version, which is precisely what makes it dangerous. But there is another version, and it is this one. In those 30 to 40 seconds, I ran the calculations. I ran them with a speed and completeness that told me this was not the first time they had been running. These were not new calculations. My mind had been performing them since Saturday morning, since the newspaper, since the bin. I had been running the numbers on what exposure meant for 2 days. And sitting on the edge of my bed at 9:40 in the morning with Patrick's confused voice still in my ear, I completed the calculation in a way I had not fully completed it before. Because now there was a concrete and immediate circumstance, the detective constable, the flat, the question already being asked, and the concrete and immediate circumstance forced the calculation to its terminus. The terminus was this: Patrick was 24 years old, and his life was not yet determined. He had choices ahead of him. He would go through something terrible. I did not yet know how terrible. I told myself I did not yet know, though there is a version of myself that knew exactly, but he was young and resilient, and the relationship with Glenys was strong, and he would come through it. And I had the architecture degree 18 months from completion. I had the specific intelligence for the work and the ambition and the trajectory that the ambition was already being applied to. I had, and I knew this and did not examine the knowledge, a lower tolerance for destruction than Patrick did. Patrick had a quality of survival in him, a flexibility, something that bent rather than broke. I was more brittle, and I knew it, and I had been calling it strength for 24 years. I want to be absolutely clear about what I am saying. I want you to hear it without any of the architecture I have built around it. I decided that my life was worth more than Patrick's. Not his life, not his literal survival. I am not telling you I chose my life over his life. I am telling you something that is, in certain ways, worse than that. I looked at the cost to me, and I looked at the cost to him, and I decided that the cost to me was greater, that I had more to lose, that my future was a more valuable object than his. I dressed this up in the 30 to 40 seconds of sitting on my bed, in language about his resilience, about his youth, about the strength of his relationship with Glenys. I used his qualities against him. I took the things that were genuine and good about Patrick and employed them as justification for what I was doing to him, and then I stood up and I went to Patrick's flat, and I said nothing. I said nothing. I sat in Patrick's flat while the detective constable asked him questions. I sat on the sofa that smelled of Glenys's candles and Patrick's particular domestic life, and I watched my brother try to remember the events of a Friday night he hadn't been party to, a night he had spent quietly at home, a night that had been entirely ordinary for him right up to the moment the police came to his door. I watched him try to be helpful in the way Patrick always tries to be helpful, with a genuine, slightly anxious eagerness to give the right answer, to provide the thing that is needed, to be useful in whatever way the situation requires. And in his helpfulness, in that specific and guileless quality of his, he gave answers that were ambiguous in the worst possible direction. He said he wasn't sure of the exact time I'd taken the car. He said he'd had a few drinks that evening himself at home on the sofa, which was entirely true, and that his memory of the timing was fuzzy. He said when the detective asked him whether he was sure he'd been home all evening, she asked it gently, but she asked it directly. He said he was sure, yes, but it came out with the specific intonation of a man who has been told that something happened involving his car and who is suddenly questioning his own certainty about a night he was not present for. The intonation of doubt, entering the voice of someone who has no cause to doubt. I watched the detective notice that intonation. I watched her write something on her pad. Patrick looked at me twice during the interview, both times with a look I have not been able to fully decode in 22 years. It was not accusatory. I want to be specific about that. It was not the look of a man who suspected me of something. It was the look of a man who was confused and who was looking at the person he most trusted for some indication of how to navigate the confusion. He was looking at me the way he looked at me when we were children, and something happened that he didn't understand, some adult interaction, some social weather he hadn't learned yet to read, and he would look at me because I was the one who read those things faster, and he trusted my reading. He was asking me what to do, and I looked back at him with a steady, neutral face. I have been living in that face for 22 years. The investigation took 3 weeks. The evidence was circumstantial, but it accumulated with the specific efficiency of circumstantial evidence in a case with no other plausible narrative. Patrick's car, Patrick's registration, Patrick's jacket. I had left the jacket in the car, crumpled on the back seat, and it was found, and it had his initials on the inside label. Patrick's inability to provide a precise and confident alibi that the investigators found convincing, partly because he was genuinely uncertain of some of the specifics the time I left, the exact moment he noticed the car was gone, and partly because the experience of being investigated for something you know nothing about produces, in the innocent, a quality of confused anxiety that reads, to a certain kind of trained eye, like guilt. No one came to me in those 3 weeks. I told myself this was because I was not there, not implicated, not in the investigative frame. I told myself that if they came to me, I would tell the truth. I held this as a private condition. If they come to me, I'll tell the truth with the full understanding, buried just below the surface of the condition, that they were not going to come to me because Patrick's answers had given them no reason to. The charges were filed on November 7th. Causing death by dangerous driving, failing to stop at the scene of an accident, failing to report an accident. Patrick was arrested on a Wednesday. I remember the call. His voice was different, not frightened exactly, but reduced, like a signal losing its source. He kept saying it was a mistake. He kept saying they had the wrong person. He said, "James, you know I was home." And I said, "I know, Patrick, I know." And every word was a stone placed in a wall I was building between him and the truth he deserved. I went to see him twice before the trial, once at the house, once at the solicitor's office. Both times he said, tell them what you know. Tell them I was home." And I did tell them that. I gave a statement saying that Patrick had lent me the car on the evening of the 14th and that I had returned to his flat briefly before heading home, which was false. I had not returned to his flat. I had gone directly home, but the statement muddied the timeline in a way I calculated would create reasonable doubt rather than resolve the thing. It did not create reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Guilty on all counts. Patrick Calloway was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. He served 5 years and 3 months before early release. I attended the sentencing. I sat in the gallery with my mother. My father had died the previous year, a fact that exists in its own particular dimension of mercy, and I will not examine it here. And my mother held my hand, and she was crying quietly, not sobbing, but the specific, continuous weeping of a person whose grief has reached a depth beyond drama. And I held her hand, and I watched my brother stand in the dock and hear the word that would redirect the entire vector of his life. And I felt something. I have spent 22 years trying to describe accurately what I felt in that moment, and I have found only one word that I can stand fully behind: recognition. I recognized what I had done. Not for the first time I had known what I was doing in the 30 seconds on the edge of my bed. The calculations were not unconscious, but I recognized it in the register of the irreversible. The way you recognize a door that has closed behind you and will not open in that direction again. It was not guilt exactly, or not only guilt. Guilt is a feeling, and what I am describing was more structural than a feeling. It was the understanding, cold and complete, that there was now a before and an after in my life, and that the before was gone and the after was what I was going to have to build a self inside of. I squeezed my mother's hand. She said, "He'll be all right, James. He's strong." I said, "I know." Episode 5. The Architecture of a Life Borrowed. The years between Patrick's sentencing and his release are the years I am least able to be honest about, and so they are the years I am most obligated to examine. I finished my degree. I took a position at a firm in Leeds, then London, then established my own small practice in Manchester at 31, always Manchester, always the city I had committed the crime in, which I have turned over many times and never arrived at a satisfying interpretation of. It was not penance. I don't think I'm capable of penance in any genuine sense. It might have been a form of witness. Staying in the place where the thing happened, within the geography of the consequence, as a way of remaining in contact with the reality of it. Or it might simply have been that Manchester was where I knew, where my networks were, where the work was, and that my decision to stay had nothing spiritual in it whatsoever. I designed buildings. I designed them well. I have a reputation, modest but genuine, for a specific quality in my residential work, an understanding of the relationship between private and shared space, between the room that belongs to one person and the corridor that belongs to everyone. My clients speak of this with an appreciation that I receive with the specific, complicated grace of a man who knows the origin of the skill and cannot share it. The skill comes from years of thinking about the difference between what belongs to you and what belongs to your brother, and what happens when those categories are violated. I married at 28. Her name is Catherine Bell, and she is not part of this story in any way that requires her full accounting, but she deserves to be named and treated with honesty in the naming. We were together for 11 years. She is a GP in Salford, and she is a good person, with a specific quality of moral clarity that I found attractive and then necessary, and then, at some point, quietly exhausting, in the way that genuine qualities become exhausting when you are living inside a major deception and the person next to you is very good at seeing through things. She didn't know what I had done. I want to be explicit about that. Catherine was not complicit, was never given the choice to be complicit. And the absence of that choice was itself a thing I did to her that sits in its own file alongside everything else. I gave her a version of me that had been redacted. She married the redacted version. She might have made a different choice with the original. We had Mara in 2006. Patrick was still in prison when Mara was born. I brought Mara to see Patrick when she was 8 months old, on one of the approved visiting days, and he held her with the specific delicacy of a man who has been in a place where nothing delicate is handled, and who has suddenly been handed something that requires the most careful management of his own strength. He held her with his hands too wide, too careful, and he looked at her face with something I can only describe as a kind of starved recognition, the recognition of a man who has been away from ordinary tenderness for so long that its sudden presence is almost too much to receive. Without breaking, he said she looked like me. I said she looked like us. He laughed. He laughed first, and then I laughed. And for 30 seconds in that visiting room, we were simply brothers. And the thing between us, the thing only I knew was there, was briefly invisible. Not gone, invisible, which is not the same thing. I need to tell you about the financial arrangements because they are part of the structure of what I did, and they are not adequately captured by any of the terms usually employed for this kind of thing. I did not simply send Patrick money. I did not simply pay reparations to my own conscience through his bank account. What I did was more architecturally complex than that, and, I think, more revealing of the specific shape of my guilt. From the year Patrick was released, he was 31. I was 31. We are twins. I will not keep clarifying this, I began, quietly and without naming its source. To ensure that Patrick had what he needed to survive, I covered the deposit on his first flat after he got out. I did this through a set of fictional circumstances. I told Patrick I'd been holding money for him, savings I'd built from some freelance work I'd done in his name before the arrest, money I owed him. And Patrick accepted this with the grateful exhaustion of a man whose energy for scrutinizing gifts has been worn down by years of having nothing given to him. When he needed a car, I bought one through a third party and had it transferred to him as a bequest from a great uncle who had died and who had in fact died, but had left nothing to either of us. When his flat needed repairs that his landlord wouldn't make, I paid a contractor directly and never told Patrick who had arranged it. When he had a period of 3 months in 2013 where he couldn't find enough work, and I could see in the quality of his phone calls the specific contraction of a man running out of options, I deposited money into his account. As a gift from a charitable fund, I had invented a fund for the re-entry of former prisoners into the workforce, a thing that exists in name, but was, in my case, populated entirely by my own money, sent through a solicitor's account as a processing intermediary. He never questioned any of it. And I told myself this was because Patrick trusted me, that the trust was a function of our brotherhood, our history, the fundamental orientation of his character toward openness and away from suspicion. That the trust was a quality of Patrick's that I was, in this particular instance, benefiting from in the same way I had benefited from all his qualities over the course of our lives. But there are moments, the middle of the night moments, the 3 a.m. moments, that are available to a person who has been in a hospital room for 3 weeks and cannot sleep, where I hear the trust differently. Where the trust sounds less like Patrick's openness and more like Patrick's ignorance. Where I understand that Patrick never questioned the gifts because Patrick had no reason to question the gifts. He didn't know he was being compensated. He didn't know there was a debt. He thought his brother was generous. He thought I was the kind of man who saw when someone needed help and gave it quietly, without making a production of his goodness. He thought I was good. There is a version of my marriage to Catherine that is relevant here, and I am going to tell it plainly, because I believe in plainness now that I have nothing to gain from its opposite. When Catherine left, when we decided together, with the particular terrible civility of 2 people who have been honest with each other about everything except the most important thing, to divorce, she said something to me in the last proper conversation we had before the conversations became logistical. She said, "I have always had the feeling, James, that there is a room in you I have never been allowed to enter." She said this without particular anger, without the drama of accusation, the way someone states an observation they have held for a long time and finally decided to release. I told her she was wrong. She said, "I know you believe that." She was the most perceptive person I have ever been married to, which is a sentence with only one member on either side of the comparison. She deserved a more complete husband. Mara deserved a more complete father. I have done well enough with Mara, well enough in the sense that she loves me and calls on Wednesdays and is flying home when she can arrange the flights, which I have told her is not necessary and which I privately want with a desperation I can't allow to reach my voice. But I have done less well with Mara than a man without a sealed room in him might have done. And I am aware of that, and the awareness is one of several that are available to me now and were not available to me earlier. Because dying performs a specific and unglamorous function on the things you have refused to see. The things you refuse to see in life are the things that are waiting in the room at 3 in the morning. And I should tell you about the one night I almost told Patrick. Episode 6, Birch Street, 2011. It was 9 years after. I was 33. Patrick was 33. He had been out of prison for 2 years. He was living in a flat in Gorton, working as a junior designer for a small print firm. Not the illustration career he'd been building before, not the work that had the quality of his restraint in it, but honest work, steady work, the work of a man rebuilding from a lower floor than the one he'd started from. We went to the pub one evening in March, the Birch Street Arms, which was his local then, and which I found I preferred. to the places closer to my part of the city. It was quieter, less designed, the kind of pub that has been in the same ownership for 20 years and shows it in the way the good pubs show age, with accumulated particularity rather than accumulated neglect. We had been there for perhaps 2 hours. The conversation had that specific ease that the years had begun to restore between us. Not the ease of before, never that, because before was before the prison, and the prison existed between us, like a fact of geography, but a new ease, built of the present rather than the past. The ease of two people who have decided, without saying so, to live forward rather than backward. Patrick was on his third pint. I was on my second. And he said something quietly, without particular drama, the way he says the things that matter, without ceremony, the way the drawings held back what the person gave away. He said, "Do you ever think about why I didn't fight it harder?" I asked him what he meant. He said, "At the trial, the solicitor said there were avenues, there were things that could have been argued. He said I should consider a particular line of defense, and I told him not to. He said he wasn't sure why. He said at the time it felt like there was something he was protecting that he couldn't name, and that in the years since he had come to understand that the something was probably me. I felt the glass in my hand. He said, I think I believed at some level that if we'd fought harder, something would have come out that would have been worse. Not worse for me, worse for you. I don't know what, but I think I made a choice without knowing I was making it." He said this to the middle distance, to somewhere between us and the bar, in the particular way he speaks when he is thinking rather than performing thought. And then he looked at me, and he said, "That probably sounds mad." I said, "It doesn't sound mad." He said, "You'd tell me, wouldn't you, if there was something I didn't know?" I held the glass. I have done more with that memory in the years since than with almost any other I possess. I have taken it apart and rebuilt it more times than I can count, because it contains in its 30-second duration the entire architecture of what I did to Patrick and what I have been doing to him since. He knew. Not what, not specifically he did not know. I was in the car, I am certain of that, but he knew that the shape of things was wrong. He knew it in the way that twins know things, in the register below language, in the bone-deep instinct for each other's states that we had spent our whole lives developing and never fully trusted. He knew something was incomplete. He had protected me from his own knowing, at cost to himself, without knowing that was what he was doing. And when he asked me directly with that specific, heartbreaking directness of his, the directness of someone who has nothing left to lose and is simply asking the question because the question needs to be asked, I looked at him and I said, "There's nothing you don't know, Patrick." He held my gaze for a moment. He said, "Okay." He drank his pint. We talked about other things, his new position at the firm, the flat in Gorton, a woman he had met briefly and was considering contacting again. We talked about our mother, who was in declining health by then. We talked about football with the distracted energy of two people who are both slightly paying attention to football and slightly using it as a way of being in a room together without saying anything real. I drove home that night with my hands very steady on the wheel. The steadiness is the thing I am least proud of, not the lie itself. The lie was the old lie, the original, the one I had built my life around. The steadiness was new. The steadiness was the lie already so integrated that it produced no physiological interference in the system. The steadiness was the lie become character. I think about that drive often. I think about the version of the evening in which I said, "Yes, Patrick, there is something you don't know." And I think about what that evening would have produced, the opening of everything, the unraveling, the terrible renegotiation of every interaction we had ever had. I think about what Patrick's face would have done, the specific expression his face takes when he receives something he did not expect and has not prepared for the slight opening of it, the brief, undefended quality, and then the closing, the private processing, the moving of the new thing into the interior, where he does whatever Patrick does with hard things, which is something I have never been fully permitted to see. I think about whether he would have forgiven me. I don't know. I have genuinely never arrived at an answer. It is the one question in this entire accounting that remains fully open, and I have lived with it for 35 years of twinness and 9 years of guilt and everything since, and I cannot resolve it. Patrick's capacity for forgiveness is one of the 2 or 3 things about him that I most clearly cannot understand from the inside of my own character, because I don't have the same capacity, and so I can't trace it to its source. I know it's real. I know it produces genuine outcomes. I know that the people Patrick has forgiven have been changed by the experience in ways that suggest the forgiveness was an event, not merely a declaration. But I don't know if there is a threshold. I don't know what the thing is that exists beyond the threshold of even Patrick's forgiveness. I am going to find out in approximately 7 hours. Or I am not. I haven't decided yet. Episode 7. Owen. I should tell you about Owen Marsh. Not because you haven't been waiting for this. I know you have been waiting for this. Waiting for the moment when the man who is being accounted for is given his full weight. But because I have spent 22 years telling myself that I think about Owen Marsh, and I think I need to examine what that thinking has actually consisted of. The official record tells me what I know of Owen factually. 23 years old at the time of his death, born in Glossop. 1 older sister, 1 younger. Father was a surveyor, mother was a teaching assistant. He had been in Manchester for 18 months at the time of the accident. Having left Glossop as many people leave smaller towns for larger cities at 22 or 23 in search of the particular form of life that cities make available to young people who have outgrown the scale of the place they were born in. He worked at Hadley's restaurant, which no longer exists, as I have told you. He had been working there for a year. I know this from the newspaper coverage at the time of the accident, and from the coverage at the time of the trial, which I read in its entirety, every article, in the specific compulsive thoroughness of a man who is trying to know the person he killed without risking the exposure that actually knowing him would require. I could not be seen asking questions. I could not be seen attending the inquest or the trial. I read the newspaper and I assembled Owen Marsh from the facts it gave me. He cycled to work every day. This is a detail that appears in the sister's statement. She gave a statement to the newspaper after the trial, after Patrick's conviction, in which she spoke with a controlled and specific anger about the inadequacy of the sentence for what her brother's death represented, and in which she mentioned, almost as an aside, that Owen had cycled everywhere since he was 12, that the bicycle was how he thought, how he processed things, that some of his best ideas came to him on the bike. She said he was going to start a business. He had a specific plan. She didn't give the details, but she said he had talked about it with her the last time she'd seen him, 2 weeks before, and that the plan was solid, the kind of plan that comes from someone who has genuinely thought it through rather than imagined the conclusion of it. Owen Marsh was 23 years old and had a solid plan and wore a reflective vest because he was a careful person, and he was killed by someone who made a calculation about whose life was more valuable. I want to say his name one more time before I continue. Owen Marsh. I have said his name in private every day for 22 years, not as penance. I said, I am not capable of genuine penance, but as the minimum preservation of the fact of him. In a world in which I have told no one what I did, in which the official record attributes his death to the wrong man, the private repetition of his name is the only witness I have available. It is insufficient. It is grotesquely insufficient, but it is what I have. His sister's name is Caroline Marsh. She will be 45 now. She was 26 at the time of the trial. I have not contacted her. I have considered it many times with a seriousness that I want to be clear was not merely fantasy. I have written letters and not sent them. I have found her address through public records and written it down and then destroyed the paper. Each time The decision not to send the letter has been made on grounds that I have examined for honesty with varying degrees of success. The most honest version of the grounds is this: that a letter from me to Caroline Marsh would be, in its deepest structure, for me. It would be for my accounting. It would ask Caroline Marsh to carry something on my behalf, the knowledge that Patrick Calloway did not kill her brother without having the power to give her what she actually needs, which is the full truth, delivered to an authority with a capacity to act on it. In other words, I could not write the letter without also handing myself to the police. And I have not been ready to do that. I am dying. I am not ready even now, which is a fact I am going to give you without the architecture of justification, because I have used enough architecture. I am not ready to go to the police, partly because the law is not the primary arena of this accounting anymore. The primary arena is the room I am in and the conversation I will or will not have when Patrick walks through that door in 7 hours. Partly because a deathbed confession to the police, while I am unable to stand for a doc, while the consequences will fall primarily on Patrick and Caroline and the families rather than on me in any meaningful way, feels like a specific kind of cowardice dressed as its opposite. Partly, I admit, because I am afraid. Not of dying. I am not afraid of dying. I have been in this room for 3 weeks, and I have become, with a speed that surprised me, accustomed to the idea of ending. The body naturalizes its own dissolution in ways the mind, prior to the experience, cannot anticipate. What I am afraid of is the specific thing that dying has made visible, which is the totality of what I have built on top of the lie. The career, the practice, the reputation modest but genuine, as I have said, and genuinely earned in the sense that the work was good, even if the man doing the work was not what the work implied him to be. Mara. Above all, Mara, who is 19 and is the person in my life most innocent of everything I have done, and who has a father who is dying, and who does not yet know that the father she is grieving is not entirely the person she has been grieving. I am afraid of what the full truth does to her understanding of herself, which is built partly on her understanding of me, the way all children's understanding of themselves is built partly on their understanding of their parents. I have been afraid of all of this for 22 years. Dying has not made me less afraid. This is one of the things I did not expect. I expected dying to be clarifying in the way it is described as clarifying the falling away of the inessential, the sudden luminous visibility of what matters. And some of that has happened. But the fear has not fallen away. The fear is as present and as specific as it was at 24, sitting on the edge of the bed in Patrick's jacket, running the calculations. The difference is that now I am running them with full information. And the full information is this: Patrick is 51 minutes younger than me and has lived the last 22 years inside a story that was not his. Not only the prison, the 5 years and 3 months, the concrete and the metal and the specific erasure of ordinary time that incarceration performs on a person. Not only the career that did not happen, the illustration work that was interrupted and never fully resumed, the small exhibition he'd been planning that was canceled, and the gallery that did not reschedule, and the creative momentum that dissipated in the way creative momentum dissipates when it is not continuously cultivated and cannot simply be picked up again when the years return. Not only Glennis, who waited 18 months and then stopped coming, and who I saw once in 2009 on a street in Manchester, and who saw me and kept walking at a pace that told me everything about what the knowledge of our family had cost her. Not only any of those specific and concrete losses. What I took from Patrick is harder to name than any of those, and I am going to try. I took from Patrick the story of himself, the narrative he was building consciously and unconsciously, the way all people build it, of a person moving forward in a particular direction, accumulating a particular set of experiences that would in time add up to a particular kind of life. The illustration, career, the relationship with Glennis, the small flat he was saving for, and which he had mentioned once with a specific and contained excitement that I recognize now as the sound of someone picturing their own future with pleasure and belief. All of that was a story Patrick was in the middle of living. It had momentum and direction and the specific quality of a life whose next chapters feel both uncertain and possible, which is the condition of youth and is precious in ways that are only visible once it is gone. I stopped that story, and then I handed him a different story. The story of a man who was in the wrong place with the wrong car and whose life was redirected by an accident, and he has been living that story for 22 years. Not unwillingly, not without resilience, without the quality I always called his softness, and now understand was something far more durable than anything I possess. He built a life in the alternative story. He found work and a flat and the occasional relationship, and he has maintained a connection with me that required either genuine love or genuine obliviousness, or, which is perhaps most accurate, a combination of both that only a twin could have sustained. He built a life in the story I gave him without knowing it was my story and not his. And he is coming in the morning. He will come in at 10 o'clock carrying coffee from the place on Ambrose Street, and he will sit in the chair beside my bed that the nurses have positioned at a specific angle that I have noticed is the angle of a seat positioned for a long conversation rather than a brief visit. He will look at me with the specific look he has been using since I was admitted, the look that is doing the work of not showing what it knows, which is to say the look of someone who has made a private peace with what is coming and is simply present for the duration of what remains. He will ask how I slept, and then I will have a choice. Episode 8. The Weight of the Glass, Revisited. There is a quality of the early morning in a hospital ward that I have not encountered in any other context. It is not the quality of early morning anywhere else. It is not the gray light of a city waking, not the particular silence of a house before the household begins. It is the specific quality of a place that does not sleep. The ward does not sleep. The machines do not sleep. The nurses working the overnight do not sleep, and yet which achieves, at around 4 or 5 in the morning, something that resembles the cessation of the ordinary in a way that is its own category of quiet. I have been awake in that quiet for the last 2 hours. I am not in pain tonight. There are nights when the pain is present and specific, and I have asked for the medication, and it has been given, with a straightforward institutional efficiency that is one of the hospital's genuine mercies. No judgment, no delay. The simple fact of a body in pain being given what it needs to reduce the pain. Tonight is not that night. Tonight the body is doing the slow subterranean work of its deterioration without producing pain as a signal it is beyond. Signals now, in some ways, beyond the communicative function of pain, just working with the quiet industry of a process that has its own momentum and its own completion date. I am going to die within weeks. I want to say that plainly because it has taken me some time to say it plainly, even to myself. And the plainness of it is, I have found, its own form of relief. The euphemisms available for dying are extraordinary in their variety and their cowardice. Passing, losing the battle, slipping away, unquote. All of them designed to soften the fact for the people in the room, all of them performing a service for the living at the expense of the dying, who are in possession of the fact and do not require its softening, who might in fact be better served by the plain word, dying. I am dying. The thing that is happening to me is the thing that happens to everything, and it is happening to me now, in this room, in these weeks. And what I do with the hours between now and then is the last meaningful act available to me. What I do with the next 30 minutes before the light changes and Patrick becomes a possibility rather than an abstraction is where I am now. I want to tell you what I have not said in this full accounting. Not what I have hidden nothing, or I have tried to hide nothing. I have tried to maintain the precision I named as my last dignity, but what the accounting has, in its process, revealed to me, what I have discovered in the saying of it that I did not know before I said it. Here is what I have discovered. I have been describing, for the last however many hours, a man who made a catastrophic moral choice and then built a life on top of it. I have been describing that man with what I have told myself is honesty. And the honesty is real. I have not softened the choice. I have not excused it. I have given you the 30 seconds in their full clarity, the calculations in their full coldness. But there is a thing I have been leaving out. Not a fact. The facts are all present. Something else. A texture. A quality of the life that I have constructed on top of the choice, which is that the life Mara, the work, the buildings that exist in Manchester because I designed them, the specific and genuine pleasure I have taken in my relationship with Patrick in the years since he was released, the love that is real, even if the foundation it sits on is catastrophically compromised, the life has not felt hollow. And I am not sure what to do with that. I think I have always expected, in some private, pre-conscious anticipation of this accounting, that when I finally examined everything honestly, the life would reveal itself as hollow. The imposter's life, built on false pretenses, therefore false. I expected the exposure to be the revelation of emptiness, of a shell, of the specific spiritual condition described in the literature of guilt and self-deception as the life unlived. But it has not been hollow. It has been a real life, a compromised, built on wrong foundations, irreversibly damaged, something real life. Mara is real. The buildings are real. The affection between me and Patrick, which has persisted across prisons and silences and 30-year-old calculations, is real. And I do not know what to do with the reality of those things, alongside the reality of what I did to make them possible. Because if the life is real, if the love in it is genuine, if the work was honestly done within the dishonestly obtained freedom that produced it, then I am not simply the villain of this story. And I am not simply the victim. I am something that does not have a clean category, which is to say, I am human, which is to say, I am the same as everyone else in the specific register of moral complexity. And the specific register of moral complexity is the one that is hardest to live in and the only one that is actually honest. I have been living inside a crime for 22 years, and I have also been living inside a life. Both are true. Both will remain true after I am gone. Patrick will carry both. Mara will carry both. Caroline Marsh, if she ever knows, will carry whatever she can bear of both. The night is almost over. I should tell you the last thing. The thing I have been circling. There was a moment I have not told you this. I have gone around it 4 times and gone around it again, a moment in the final week before the trial, when Patrick and I were sitting in the kitchen of our mother's house. We were there for a Sunday dinner that had the quality of the last things the last Sunday before everything changed into the official shape of the catastrophe. Our mother had made the food she always made, the specific lamb, and the specific potatoes, and the specific gravy that was not quite like anyone else's gravy. The gravy that now, in this room, in the diminished register of my appetite, is what I would request if I could request anything. We were sitting at the kitchen table after the meal. Our mother had gone to bed early. The strain of those weeks was visible in her. She had aged in the 6 months of the investigation in a way that was faster than biology, the aging of a person absorbing a grief they don't understand and can't resolve. And Patrick and I were sitting with the remains of the meal, between us and the kitchen light overhead and the window dark. Patrick said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I waited. He said, "I keep thinking about the night you borrowed the car." He said, "Not because of the accident." He said, "I just keep thinking about you borrowing my jacket and driving away and me watching the headlights go from the window." He said he didn't know why that particular image kept returning me, pulling away in his car, wearing his jacket, the headlights sweeping the road, and then gone. He said there was something in it he couldn't name. He looked at me across the kitchen table with the look he has, which is the look I have spent 31 years knowing, and which I am running out of time to see. And he said, "You were wearing my jacket, James." It was not an accusation. I want to be absolutely clear about that. He was not saying, "You were wearing my jacket, James," and so the investigators assumed he was not drawing the thread I was drawing in my chest when he said it, the thread that, if pulled, unravels everything. He was simply noting a detail that had returned to him, the image of me pulling away, the jacket, the headlights, the specific ordinariness of an evening that had preceded everything. But I have never been able to fully convince myself of that. I have lived for 22 years inside the uncertainty of whether Patrick knew, not the facts, not the confession I never made, but whether, at some level below language, in the bone-deep register of twins who have been oriented toward each other since before birth, whether he knew, whether he chose, whether what happened in that kitchen table moment, what happened in the interview room when the detective asked her questions, and Patrick gave his confused and insufficient alibi, what happened in the dock when he chose not to pursue the defense. His solicitor offered whether those choices were, in some part, Patrick's own 30-second calculation, run in a direction opposite to mine, whether he looked across the room of our shared life and made a decision about whose future was worth more, whether he chose mine. I cannot know this. I will not know this unless I ask him, and I can only ask him if I tell him everything first. The light in the corridor has changed. The ward has begun its slow, non-dramatic morning mobilization, the change of shift, the particular sound of wheels on the floor, a voice somewhere asking a question and receiving an answer. It is early morning. It is the day Patrick is coming. In my mind, I can already hear the specific rhythm of his walk, the way he lists slightly to the left, a habit from the prison years that he has never fully shed, a compensation for some old injury sustained in a place and manner he has never fully described to me. I can hear the particular knock he gives to a door that is already open 3 short, a pause, a 4th, announcing himself to a room while already entering it, the habit of a man who learned not to walk into closed spaces without warning. He will come in carrying the coffee. He will sit in the chair at the angle the nurses have arranged. He will look at me, and I will have, from the moment he enters the room until the moment he asks me how I slept, a 30-second window, the same window. I am 51 minutes older than my brother. I do not know, even now, even with everything laid out in the dark of this room, with nothing left between me and the truth of what I have done, I do not know which of us has been paying the greater cost. I have been assuming for 22 years that the answer was him. The sound in the corridor is louder now, a trolley, the rhythmic squeak of a wheel that needs oil and hasn't been given it. I have been listening to that wheel for 3 weeks. The window behind the chair shows the specific blue-gray of a morning that hasn't decided yet whether it will be clear. I am going to ask Patrick what he knows, or I am going to hold his hand and drink the coffee from Ambrose Street and tell him I slept fine and let the morning be what it is, ordinary and insufficient, and in its ordinariness and insufficiency, the last one I am likely to have with my brother, which is a thing I cannot hold in my mind at its full size without losing something. I am going to ask him. I am going to ask him, or I am not going to ask him, and the distance between those 2 choices is 30 seconds, and I have been in that distance before, and I know what I did there. What I do not know, what I will not know until he walks through the door, is who I am now. The wheel in the corridor turns. The morning comes, and I can hear him.